Alright, we're gonna get into this other book. It's called The History of Ancient America by George Jones, but that's not the full title. Let me just show you right here. Again, The History of Ancient America, anterior to the time of Columbus, proving the identity of the Aborigines with the Tyrians and Israelites. The Aborigines of America with Israelites, and the introduction of Christianity into the Western Hemisphere by the Apostle St. Thomas by George Jones. Alright, and we're going to go to chapter 2 of this book. It says the northern Aborigines have a traditional knowledge of the deluge, alright, the flood, and the dove of peace, which to them under the name of the medicine or mystery bird is sacred from the arrow of the hunter. They have their Ark of Covenant, alright, so the Indians have an Ark of Covenant again, in which has deposited some mystery seen only by the priest of the tribe. It is said to be a shell and supposed to give out oracular sounds. This is an analogy to the Book of the Laws, placed in the Ark of Covenant by Moses, preceding his death on Mount Nebo, Utah. Alright, check it out, Moses in America, my video. The oracular wisdom of which has guided civilization to this day. The Ark has never suffered to touch the earth, but it always raised on a stand of wood or stone. They're talking about American Indians. It is invariably carried by a tribe when they march to battle. A similitude is here to Joshua at the siege of Jericho, just like Joshua did before he took Jericho. Alright, carrying the ark. Alright, so Joshua Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, is that who we're talking about? When it is in their peaceful encampment, it is surrounded by 12 stones, indicative of the original number of the tribes of their ancestors. Alright, this is talking about American Indians, remember. This is strictly in analogy with the 12 statues, probably rude blocks of stone, erected by Moses around the altar of the covenant to personify the 12 tribes of Israel. Joshua also, after the passage of the Jordan, erected 12 stones in his encampment at Gilgal, and the same number in the river at the place of the passage. They select their medicine men. Alright, again, back to the Indians. They select their medicine men, example, priests or prophets, from among a portion of the tribe, not warriors. Here is the custom of the Levites, or descendants of Aaron, being in the sacred office of priesthood. For with the Israelites they were not to be taken from the ranks of the soldiery. Alright, so you hear that? These Aborigines dwell in booths, as when brought out of the land of Egypt, for they are still wanderers. Leviticus 23. They offer a flesh or burnt offering from the chase, which is first cast into the flames before even a starving family may eat. Right? Again, we're talking about Indians here. They have their corn and harvest feast, also in one in observance of every new moon, another in festivity of the first fruits, and the great feast in direct analogy with the Hebrews, Passover. All right, we've dwelt on this before on past videos in this series. All right, you can see him saying the same thing. All right, the customs of the American Indians, even to the blood being stained upon the posts and lintels, and the mingling of the most bitter herbs. Then their fastings and purifications are practiced with the greatest severity. The breastplate or ornament worn by the religious prophets, containing 12 shells, or stones of value, and its direct imitation, high priest, in which contain 12 precious stones, inscribed with the names of all the 12 original tribes of Israel. They have their cities of refuge, or huts of safety, where the most deadly foe dare not enter for his victim. Alright, so the Indians had a lot of refuge towns or places. Alright, they never violate a female captive, and upon the Hebrew principle that their blood shall not be contaminated by interreunion. This has been strictly followed in all their wars with the Europeans. They also reject the savage practice of civilization upon the lofty principle of manly virtue. The medicine bag or pouch is carried by every member of the tribe. It is suspended to a bead belt which crosses the breast by passing over the left shoulder and hang on the right side. It contains, as they say and believe, preservatives to keep them from sickness or defeat. These are essentially the phylacteries referred to by the Savior and previously condemned by Moses, for the word phylactery is derived from the Greek tongue and denotes a preservative. And in the time of Moses they were worn by his people in great excess, and so by the northern native. Moses checked the excessive use of the preservatives and changed the custom, for by his command the priesthood alone wore the phylactery, which was alas a frontlet of parchment for the forehead, upon which was written an extract from the laws, that those that run might read. Then the absence of all idols or symbolical devices, and the worship of one God. Example, the Great Spirit. Alright, so we're not talking about religions, we're not talking about anything to do with gold worshiping or Abrahamic religions, as you call it. We're just talking about that you're the book. All right, no idol worship, just like the Israelites. One God is the Great Spirit. It's the same thing. Wakan Tanka, Wakang Tanka Hawa, Jahwa. All right, they're never pronouncing the name Jehovah, but in syllables, and those separated by long ceremonies, thus truly fulfilling the Hebrew law. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. The name with them sounds as if written Je-ho-va, and it's not that, because we know already from the past videos, right? It's a wa. They had the Jehovah, Jehovah, Jehovah. You can hear it in their music, in their chants, Jehovah. The Lakota, right? Jehovah. We read that already. All right. So again, in syllables, Jehovah, and is only pronounced by the Aaron of the tribe. In their hymns of rejoicing, the word hallelujah is distinctly uttered. All right, they say hallelujah, hallelujah, hey, hallelujah, Hawa, Jehovah. It's to the foregone analogies is to be added the general and firm belief in the immortality of the soul. But beyond all this proof of their origin is the practice of the great covenant between the Almighty Father and the patriarch Abraham, circumcision. And it does not exist as in parts of Egypt and the Asiatic nations for the purpose of supposed health, in which belief it was practiced in ancient Egypt by both sexes, but as a religious custom handed down from time immemorial, alright, the Indians. The custom now is not general, but it does exist, and we must be understood as referring back at least 200 years in our review, to the period of the Pilgrim Fathers, when the northern Aborigines numbered 15 millions. 15 millions. The Pilgrims got there. Now they scarcely number 2.5. All the customs, however, noticed are practiced at the present period by the uncontrolled Aboriginal, the uncontrolled rebels. If all other evidences were not received, that of circumcision as a religious ceremony must be viewed by the most skeptical as direct proof of identity between the northern Aborigines and the ancient Hebrews. The customs we have written is not general. It is only found in the more settled tribes. This even supports our belief, for in this very fact is traced again the precedent ordained by Moses, For circumcision was discontinued by the great lawgiver for 40 years during his journeying with his followers through the wilderness. The custom was reestablished by Joshua. May not this innovation by Moses in the covenant custom be imitated by these descendants? Are they not still wanderers in the wilderness in the western, as their ancestors were in the eastern hemisphere? The affirmative has existed for ages, and even now continues. They have not yet returned to Jerusalem. You have not returned to Jerusalem. One fact is of great importance and proof of their great antiquity. They have no knowledge or tradition in the north of the life or crucifixion of Christ, but yet they have a knowledge of the deluge, and actually practice the laws of Moses. So you came here with your foreign language, with your gods of stone and wood, all right, Deuteronomy 28, and you will worship them. And you know what did Jehoshua the Hawashi tell us? The original deliverer who delivered the Israelites to Jerusalem. All right, what did he say? Be brave and don't mention the name of their gods. Don't worship them. Don't bow down to them. All right, and he said, follow the laws. All right, again, and actually they practiced the laws of Moses, the Indians. Again, we must repeat that we are writing of these Aborigines. Again, we are writing of these Aborigines as they were at the time of European colonization. How they found them. They found you, right? Copper-colored tribes of America. This is how they find you. Right? Practicing the laws of Moses. That Las Casas was firmly persuaded that the Indians were descended from the Hebrews is evident from his own words. Lo que la tua manifestum te fecit. Your speech betrays you, as recorded by Torquemada. If the work of that illustrious prelate, who was intimately acquainted with Columbus, whose life he wrote, and who was one of the first Spaniards who proceeded to the continent of America, where he must have had an opportunity to become acquainted with the traditions, had ever been published, we should have known his reasons for coming to that conclusion. That bishop was too rational to adopt the hypothesis embraced by Acosta and Torquemada, that the devil had actually counterfeited the history, laws, rites, ceremonies, and customs of the Jews in the New World, but he believed that the Hebrews had colonized America. All right? And just to read the footnote, it's a little small here, but it says, those words we read in Latin, says the words lo que la tua manifestum te fecit, that La Casa says in reference to the Mexicans and other Indian tribes, whom he took to be real Hebrews, deserved the most serious attention because he was here. We have here the opinion of a person who was well acquainted with the Mexicans and Peruvians, the Amarucans, and who proceeded to America immediately after its discovery by the Spaniards, spent there the greater part of a long life, and solemnly recorded in a testamentary document his conviction of a fact which he might have had many reasons for not choosing to divulge. Antiquities of Mexico, page 331. All right. It says Las Casas even goes so far as to say that the language of the island of Santo Domingo was corrupt Hebrew. We got Roland, another person that was in Columbus ship, also saying the same, that it was corrupt Hebrew, because they don't know the real ancient Paleo Hebrew. They call it corrupt Hebrew. They're the ones speaking corrupt Hebrew. At the same time, that great credit must be attached to Sosamni. Bernard de Sahagún. Alright, continuing in the book, it says Bernard de Sahagún, one of the first preachers in New Spain, says that he found it to be a universally received tradition amongst the nations, confirmed by the testimony of their historical paintings, that a colony had arrived long before the Christian era on the coast of America, from a region situated to the northeast called Chicomostoc, first touching on the shores of Florida. And further down in the book, I want to read this part. It says, Sahagún further complains that he was forcibly deprived of a very valuable painting, representing the great temple, with the cord by which it was surrounded, which he says was sent to Spain. It is very evident that everything in Mexico, calculated to draw attention to the ancient history of that country, more especially if connected with religious recollections, was carefully removed from notice. So they were hiding all these evidence, all these artifacts that was proven who these people were from the old world and their practices. Immediately after the conquest, pieces of sculpture were mutilated or buried, paintings were burned, temples and edifices, which from their size it was impossible to destroy, were suffered to fall into oblivion, and magnificent monuments of ancient art, such as the temples of Palenque, all right, we're going to get into Palenque, all right, art, and palaces of Mitlan were passed unnoticed by Spanish authors. Sahagún, when engaged in the compilation of his history, after it had been taken away from him and again restored, so they had taken all his work and they had restored it back to him, received 3 cautions, but they told him 3 cautions, right? They warned them. First, to write nothing to prove that the Hebrews had colonized the New World. All right, you hear what they told him to do? I didn't know this. All right, they said, you can have your work back, but you can't continue to write or prove that the Hebrews had colonized the New World. Secondly, to be guarded in what he said of the devils having imitated God and taken to himself a chosen people in the New World, and counterfeiting the rites and ceremonies of the Jews. And thirdly, not to advance the hypothesis that Christianity had ever been proclaimed to the Indians, or to treat too largely on the history of Quetzalcoatl. So why would they tell them don't even talk about Quetzalcoatl? All right, so we gotta dodge the hijack when we hear Christianity, because we ain't talking about Zeus. We ain't talking about Zeus. We ain't talking about. We talking about Jehoshua, Yahawashi, Joshua, Quetzalcoatl. All right, that's why he's so important. Who is Quetzalcoatl really? Who is Joshua from the Old Testament really? All right, we're really talking about the real Yahawashi, the real deliverer, the person who really delivered the Israelites to Jerusalem with the sword, and he wasn't on a donkey saying peace to everybody like a hippie. All right, so again, they warned them, don't say they're Hebrews and don't even talk about Quetzalcoatl. It was the devil, they told them. All right, again, don't treat too largely on the history of Quetzalcoatl. Why they didn't want him to talk about it? You need to dig on Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, Amaru Khan, the Khan, Drakan, the Naga, the Biblioteca of Pinelo, a work, the express object of which was to illustrate the history of America by extracts from and references to valuable and unpublished manuscript preserved in the most famous libraries of Spain and the public archives, especially those of Simancas, to which the author, through the interest of the Duke of Medina de las Torres, obtained access, exists only in an epitome, and of the larger work a learned writer has observed, not a leaf has been found. Garcia's history of the Peruvian monarchy is also unknown. Siguenza's Mexican cyclography is stated to have been lost through the negligence of his heirs, and many other interesting works are said to have perished or been lost in a similar manner. And most likely a lot of these works are probably in the vault, the Vatican vault, right? Or just burned up. They didn't want people to ever get access to this. We just started getting access to all these books. All right, we didn't have access to any of these books before. It has been remarked before that the office of Royal Historiographer of the Indies does not appear to have been instituted solely for the purpose of promoting the cause of truth and the increase of knowledge, and it may be further observed that the Council of the Indies, which took cognizance of all writers treating of America, requiring that they should be previously to publication submitted to a strict censorship, with the power of recalling or prohibiting, even after the publication, any work they thought fit, proceeded in a diametrically opposite spirit. Antiquities of Mexico, all right, volume 6, we got that. All right, this is real work, this is real history, this is what they did. So of course, if you're the invader, all right, you're going to be able to write history because you're the one who won, right? So you're going to make sure history gets written a certain way. All right, and here we are today. Continuing with the book, The 10 Tribes of Israel, historically identified with the Aborigines of the Western Hemisphere. And now we're talking about Boturini, another famous historian and explorer at that time. All right, so before we continue with Cavalier Boturini, which it was like the knight cavalier or caballero. His name was actually Lorenzo Boturini Beneducci, all right, historian, antiquarian, ethnographer of New Spain and Spanish empires and colonial dominions in North America. Is that really what he looked like? All right, born in Italy of noble parentage. All right, he studied in Milan and lived in Trieste and Vienna, and was a knight of the Holy Roman Empire. All right. We saw who was the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and he was a brother, right? All right, so he's sending his foot soldiers over here. All right, so it says Boturini went to New Spain or America in 1736, like that area whole of southern Florida, Mexico, Central America, where he remained 8 years. During those years, he assembled a vast collection of paintings, maps, manuscripts, and native codices. He copied more than 500 pre-Columbian inscriptions and made his own drawings of monuments and sculptures, and he investigated the history of the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe on the hill of Tepeyac. All right, this was a native goddess, or it was more related to the Corn Mother, really. If you know into the history, go into the history of that. If you watch my corn videos, he traveled widely on his travels, brought together the largest collection of Mexican antiquities assembled to that time by a European. He had the largest collection of Mexican antiquities. All right, and it says called Idea de una nueva historia general, an idea of a new general history of the America Septentrional. All right, dedicated to our King, our Highness, and His Royal and Supreme Council of the Indies, by El Caballero, or the Cavalier Lorenzo Berturini Benaducci. All right, so this was published in 1746. All right, but real quick, we're just gonna go back to the other book. I'm gonna read about him a little bit. The 10 tribes of Israel, historically identified with the Aborigines of the Western Hemisphere. It says the Cavalier Berturini, an Italian by birth, visited the new continent with a view to literary and antiquarian research. This Milanese traveler, observes Humboldt, had crossed the seas with no other view than to study the history of the native tribes of America. But in traversing the country to examine its monuments and make researches into its antiquities, he had the misfortune to fall under the suspicion of the Spanish government. After having been deprived of the fruits of his labors, he was sent in 1736 as a state prisoner to Madrid. The King of Spain declared him innocent, but this does not restore to him his property, and this collection, the catalog of which Buturini published at the end of his essays on the American history of New Spain, printed at Madrid, lay buried in the archives of the University at Mexico. Those valuable relics of the culture of the Aztecs were preserved with so little care that there scarcely exists at present an 8th part of the hieroglyphic record taken from the Italian traveler, Mexican Antiquities, Volume 6. All right, so you see, all his work that he did, this Italian, they buried it. They lost a lot of it. They arrested him for nothing because he was freed. They was just trying to stall him, but you see, this is what there's a common practice throughout history that still goes on today. All right, so it says Buturini's small work entitled Idea de una nueva historia general, published in Madrid in 1746, notwithstanding his dedication of it to the king and his preliminary protest, which has 6 different licenses for publication prefixed to it, remains unpublished. All right, so again, this is the book that they said remained unpublished. Some of his collections some of that exists or that he was able to compile that was returned to him, because most of it was kept. They didn't give it back to him. So I just wanted to show and read a little bit from it. It's in Spanish. We're going to freestyle it. I'm going to translate it as I read it with you, just some parts, not all of it, just real quick, so you can see what's the kind of stuff that's in this book. Why would it remain unpublished, until, later on, and still when it was published, they didn't tell us about it. I didn't know about this book until this week. So, all right. So we're on page 99 of this book, right? Remember, Boturini's book, published in the 1700s. Well, he made it in the 1700s. They didn't publish it until later. Now it says Origen de los Indios, or the origin of the Indians of New Spain. All right. All right. So he continues, says, as thin or as weak be the first conjecture to suggest what types of words of the Indian language could be Hebrew, Egyptian, or Chaldean. All right, so he found similarities between these languages and the Indian. That's why he's pointing it out. All right, it's a lot of translating to do, but if you guys want to go ahead and do that on your own. But I just wanted to point out certain parts again of this book. So I'm in page 110, and it starts talking about the calendars they found. Boturini starts breaking down the calendar that he studied, like the Toltecan calendar, all right, which is older than the Aztec, and very similar to the Olmec, and very ancient as well. So he starts breaking it down, what he finds, and then there's like a map in the calendar, all right. So, and as the original in power of the caciques or the chiefs of their lineage, confesses this author that with their help he was able to write both stories of the Tolteca and Chichimeca, all right. And he goes on to say, which I have in my archive, so he has this, all right, Boturini. It says then that because of the reference original map, Toltecan map, our memories and antique memories, in particular one of the confusion of languages and the Tower of Babel, Torre de Babel. Again, in particular, the confusion, la confusión de las lenguas de la Torre de Babel. Que sucedió, or that happened, suppose the Toltec calendar in the year Setepalt, Pedernal, that's when it happened, en cuya ocasión, or in that occasion, by 7 Toltecos that assisted in the fabrication of said tower. Seeing that they no longer understood the rest of the people, they separated with their women and children. And then, after having pilgrimaged in Asia, some of these senios, it says, I'm not sure what that means, that was called Huetzlipocitles, finally arrived in the lands of New Spain, or America, that then was called Anahuac. All right, and it says they were traveling until they reached Tula, right, and they stopped, which became their empire there in Tula in Mexico. All right, that ancient ruins of Tula. All right, again, so this is Lorenzo Boturini's book from that time, The 10 Tribes of Israel, historically identified with the Aborigines of the Western Hemisphere. At this distance of time, when the state of the world is so different from what it was in the 16th century, it may not be readily conceived how easy it was for the Council of the Indies, through the power vested in it of permitting or prohibiting the general circulation of all writings relative to America, to keep the rest of Europe in a state of darkness respecting the history of the new continent, to keep the Europeans, the rest of the world, from knowing who we really were. For 3 centuries, those who successfully composed that council exercised their function as censors with the greatest vigilance. If powerful patronage or inadvertence on their part suffered in the first instance any obnoxious work to appear in print, it was sure soon to be recalled. Thus, the history of the Indies by Gomara, dedicated to Charles V, and the conquest of Mexico by the same author, dedicated to Don Martin Cortez, son of the celebrated conqueror, became prohibited books. They became prohibited books soon after their publication, but there were other works against which a silent war was waged in Spain. Continuing the book, The 10 Tribes of Israel, historically identified with the Aborigines of the Western Hemisphere. And now they're talking about Garcia, a famous historian explorer. Says Garcia in his famous treatise on the origin of the Indians says on the 232nd page, introduction to the 3rd book, many have supposed that the Spaniards generally who reside in the Indies believe that the Indians proceed from the 10 tribes who were lost in the time of Salmanazar, king of Assyria, of whom Rabbi Shimon Sugati, who is named Sincha by Bartolosia, says, nothing is certain nor is it known where they dwell. This opinion is grounded on the disposition, nature, and customs of the Indians, which they found very similar to those of the Hebrews. All right, Hebrews. And although some learned men are inclined to assent to such a belief, I, nevertheless, have bestowed great diligence upon the verification of this truth. All right. So he says he's done his research. All right. I can affirm that I have labored in this more than any other part of my work, and from what I have found thereto relating, I shall lay such foundations for the edifice and structure of this hypothesis as will be able to contain its weight. The entire of Garcia's third book of the origin of the Indians treats accordingly of the likeness which in their laws, their customs, their moral qualities and habits, their ceremonies, sacrifices, and inclinations to idolatry, and even in their early history, the two nations bore to each other. All right, and we can verify that because I do have the original book from Garcia. All right. So like I said, I have his book, right? So this is the one of the original books. Again, it's in Spanish because these are Spaniards, right? And this is named Origen de los Indios, or the origin of the Indians of the New World, or Occidental Indies. Investigated with discourse and opinions by Father Gregorio Garcia. All right, this is one of the books they tried not to, keep hidden, all this information that he had, and let's see why. Like the guy told us in the other book, right, that we were just reading, he told us that if you look at Garcia's third volume, which is, I have all those volumes in this book that I have here. They compiled all the volumes together, so this is Libro Tercero, or the third volume, right? And I'm just going to zoom in. I know it's going to look blurry, but all right. And chapter 1 of this volume 3, what it says here is de la quinta opinión, or the fifth opinion, en que se prueba, in which we prove that the Indians proceed or descend from Hebrews, los Hebreos, de los 10 tribus of the 10 tribes, que se perdieron, that were lost, that had gone missing. All right, that's how he starts out chapter 1 of his volume 3. So again, a lot of so this first writing is basically what we just read in the other book, how he affirms how he did his diligence, even though people may rejected this overwhelming evidence. A lot of the Spaniards that were settling down there, he says, they were saying that these are the lost 10 tribes, los 10 tribus perdidos. All right, so let's go back to the other book. This person's letting you know what's in here. All right, Lord Kingsborough in his works also grabs some information from Garcia as well. In the first chapter, he criticizes the passage of the apocryphal book of Esdras, which induced the Jews themselves to think that they had colonized America, and others to treat with grave attention that singular history. The manner in which they had crossed from one continent to another was also a subject of discussion. In the 6th chapter, which is the most curious of all, he institutes a comparison between Jewish moral and ceremonial laws and those of the Mexicans, and shows how nearly they agreed. In the 7th, he compares the Hebrew language with that of the Indian idioms, and in the 8th, he replies to some suggestions of Acosta. But I just want to show you that we do have this, and it is written here. This is his history. These are in the archives. We have access to this, and he did write a whole chapter to prove that these were the 10 lost tribes. All right, Gregorio Garcia. The 10 tribes of Israel, historically identified with the Aborigines of the Western Hemisphere. As we continue in the book, the 10 tribes of Israel, historically identified with the Aborigines of the Western Hemisphere. And when in this chapter, that's all about Quetzalcoatl. All right. So there's so many references of him. We got it before. I just want to go down to this part right here. So it says extracts from Antiquities of Mexico, volume 6. It says the Mexican deity Quetzalcoatl was to their belief born of a virgin, a native of the city of Toulon. So a virgin from Toulon. So he was born of a virgin. Who, being a devout person and engaged in sweeping the altar in the temple, perceived a ball of feathers falling through the air, which having taken up and placed in her girdle, she became pregnant. Quetzalcoatl was called on earth, and you see all this. You see this? It's not there because it says in the original Spanish manuscript, this appellative was obliterated. They took that part out, so we don't know what he was called on earth. But in heavens, he was called Chalchiluclith, supposedly, the precious stone of suffering and of sacrifice. Continues, says his feast is called the Feast of the Lords. Example, ancients. It lasted 4 days from the first Ocelot, the sign of the earth, to the fourth earthquakes or destructions in the 72nd plate of the Borgian manuscript. Iztapal, Nanascaya, or the fourth age of the Mexicans, that of flints and canes memorable for the birth of Quetzalcoatl and the destruction of the province of Tulan seems to be represented. Quetzalcoatl is there painted in the attitude of a person crucified. Quetzalcoatl painted in the attitude of a person crucified with the impression of nails in his hands and feet, but not actually upon a cross, and with the image of death beneath his feet, which an angry serpent seems threatening to devour. The 73rd plate of the Borgian manuscript is the most remarkable of all, for Quetzalcoatl is not only represented there as crucified upon a cross of Greek form, but his burial and descent into hell are also depicted in a very curious manner. Quetzalcoatl was also represented by the figure of Halokatcolt, which signifies the lion of the humankind. Other analogies extended to all the symbols mentioned above might be pointed out between the types of referring in Old Testament to Christ and the epithets bestowed by the Mexicans on Quetzalcoatl. The lion, from the little that has been preserved of life of Quetzalcoatl, it would appear, adds the commentator, that he was very anxious to verify in his own person some of the ancient prophecies relating to the Messiah, and that for this purpose he went about studiously performing certain actions by which they might appear to be fulfilled. Page 109. Continuing further down in the book, it says, the Mexicans bestowed the appellation of Toplitzin on Quetzalcoatl, the literal signification of which is our son, or our child. That proper name being compound of to, our, and pitzlin, boy or child, and as so called by the cognate terms of piltositli and pilsintin, and it may not unreasonably be assumed, since analogies which are numerous and not isolated as their number increases, increase also in the ratio of the probability, not only that the Mexicans were acquainted with Isaiah's famous prophecy, but to mark their belief of the accomplishments of that prophecy in the person of Quetzalcoatl, that they name him Toplintzin, no less on account of his having been born of a virgin, of the daughters of men, than because another equally celebrated prediction of the same prophet declared that he should receive a name from that very circumstance. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And the proper name Toplitzin does indeed bear a significance corresponding to God with us, which means God domesticated amongst men. And the full force of the expression is preserved in the term Toplitzin, which might be interpreted the Son of Man. For the Mexicans believed that Quetzalcoatl took human nature upon him, partaking of all the infirmities of man, and was not exempt from sorrow, pain, or death, which he suffered voluntarily to atone for the sins of man. They also believed that he alone had a human body and was a corporal substance, a notion which he can only wonder whence it could be arrived. Antiquities of Mexico. All right, so we gotta dodge the Christian views and stuff of these people, but they had the origin. Which one is the origin story is what we're trying to let you know. And is this, are we talking about Zeus or are we talking about Jehoshua? All right, Quetzalcoatl. All right. Both these authors, Las Casas and Torquemada, assert that Quetzalcoatl had been in Yucatan, and there can be little doubt when we reflect on the mysterious history of Bachap, that the cross discovered by M. Dupax in an ancient temple of Palenque. Alright, we're about to get in there. We have been reading about the Foreign Quarterly Review about what they've been finding in Palenque during this expedition that Dupax did. Alright, remember we read that, alright, in my other videos when we got Graham Hancock telling us how ancient America is. We're also reading about Palenque, right? We're going to get into it as well in this video. Alright, so it was connected, it says, with the tradition of his crucifixion in Palenque. Whoa, okay, so this big one, because we're going to read about what they found in Palenque, or what they discovered, and what resembles something resembles something there, right? All right, so we're talking about that Quetzalcoatl had been in the Yucatan, Las Casas and Torquemada. They believed he was a real person, all right? Also, we reflect on the mysterious history of Bachap, that the cross discovered by M. Dupax in the ancient temple of Palenque was connected with the tradition of his crucifixion. The four female figures, each holding in her arms an infant, which adorned the walls of another temple in the vicinity of that just mentioned in Palenque, right, probably represent Chibraris or Shemelham and the infant Quetzalcoatl. All right, so it talks a lot about Quetzalcoatl in this chapter. Just one more example says, with respect to the appellation of Meshi or Mesetli, the other name by which Quetzalcoatl was known among the Mexicans, it is very remarkable that it is precisely the same as the Hebrew word for which it signifies the anointed, right? It's Meshi, Meshech, Meshi, Meshech, Messiah, right? Anointed deliverer. All right, so I'm not going to read the whole book, but, there's a whole chapter on the religious observances of the Indians, how it resembles, the Hebrew ceremonies and rites and all that. There's a whole chapter on circumcision. It was prevalent amongst the Mexicans, all right? Almost in every word but Costa notices in the 17th chapter of the second book of the third decade that this custom was prevalent among the Mexicans, all right? I mean, it's a whole chapter. All these references from different people, different Indians all over the Americas being circumcised, or practicing circumcision. There's a whole chapter on the festivals. I mean, we've gone over a lot of these festivals, especially from the North American Indians, like the green corn and what that, could mean, anciently. All right, it's another chapter on language, all right, and how, well, let me just read this first part. It says, the changes to which language is subjected during a long series of ages, geographical interposition and intermarriage render the mere sounds a much less certain criterion in tracing it to its original source than its construction and those essential characteristics which are peculiar to the Hebrew, whom the writer of the primogeniture and integrity of the holy language happily characterizes as the mother who lendeth to all but borroweth from none. All right, so they're saying that's the mother tongue. All right, so there's a lot of drop here just to read a little bit. It says, La Casas affirms that in Haiti, now in Santo Domingo, the inhabitants spoke corrupt Hebrew. They styled their judges or counselors chochome, which is precisely the term by which the Jews all over Europe would designate a wise or learned rabbi. He is a great chocham. All right, same thing. The northern tribes have preserved in many cases the primitive Yahweh, and also Hallelujah. Vega affirms that Hali was the Peruvian term for praise or triumph. Then we got a whole chapter on the characteristics. All right, just read a little bit. It says, of the Choctaws, Bertram observes they were a hardy, subtle, brave, intrepid, ingenious, and virtuous race. They erected a scaffold 20 feet high in a grave upon which they lay their dead, and after sufficient time the bones are placed in a coffin fabricated of bones and splints and deposited in the bone house. The relations in the multitude follow with united voices and alternate hallelujahs and lamentations. Bertram's Travels, page 514. All right.
Way,